okay? What's our target time? Is it 40 minutes?
45, I think. Okay. Yes. Hola, bon dia a tothom. Comencem aquesta primera sessió.
Good morning. We'll start with the first session. We will start with presentations by two experts. I'll do a brief introduction on their resume.
In English, and I'll explain it shortly in Catalan. To my left, a la meva esquerra, Peter Austin.
To my left, Peter Austin. He has the Merit Rousing Chair in field linguistics, and he is the director of the Endangered Languages Academic Program, the Department of Linguistics of SOAS. I've Googled it, and this is the Asian and Oriental Studies of the University of London, the School of these studies. So his main research interests are theory and practice of language augmentation, syntax, morphosyntactic typology, computer-aided lexicography, and multimedia for endangered languages. He has an extensive fieldwork experience in Australian Aboriginal languages, and he's currently involved in a language revitalisation project in South Australia. And while the rest, you can read it in your handout. And I'll now introduce Dr. Ostler. Well, I'll do it before he speaks.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and thank you to Linguapax for the opportunity to come to Barcelona, and congratulations on 30 years of engagement with issues of linguistic diversity and linguistic vitality. Congratulations also to Matthias for the award of the Linguapax award. I'm very... Sound is terrible. Yeah. I'm very happy to be here in Barcelona. Now we're right, I think. I'm very happy to be here. Particularly enjoying the fact that you have beautiful sunshine and nice weather. Last week I was in Warsaw and it was below freezing there and not very nice, so it's great to come here. I really enjoy this city. I actually came here over many years working together. There was a project here called Linguamon, Casa de Lenguas, which ultimately was not successful, but over many years we came and worked with people there, so it's great to come back. Today I'm going to talk about engagement between universities and communities with a focus on thinking about linguistic diversity and particularly revitalizing languages. So I'll very quickly introduce some concepts. Briefly, what is language documentation? What is language revitalization from a sort of academic, theoretical, and practical point of view? And then we at SOAS, for the last 14 years, we have been training masters and PhD students in the areas of documentation and revitalization. And what I want to show you is that a couple of years ago, we reoriented our program towards engagement with the local community. And this has had a huge impact, a very positive result for us and also for the local communities. The project that I'll discuss with you is the Sylheti Project. We're working with a community in London, Sylheti people, who originally come from Bangladesh. More recently, through an EU-funded project, we have been collaborating with Leiden University and Warsaw University on a project that we call Engaged Humanities. And so I'll share with you some of the work that we have been doing there. Again, it's really engagement between university people and community people, and maybe draw some possible directions for future. Okay, so when we talk about language documentation or documenting languages, this is an approach to the study of language that emerged about 25 years ago, and here's a quotation from Nicholas Himmelmann. It's about making a record of a language or one of its varieties. The goal is to collect primary data, collect original recordings of people speaking, telling stories, singing songs, discussing their history, and to store it and preserve it for a long time. We know that languages are under pressure and under threat, and our goal is to document the current diversity and to preserve aspects of that for the future, usually involving interdisciplinary teams of researchers from many different disciplines, not just language studies, and cooperating and directly engaged with speech communities. A kind of narrow view of the outcome of this is an annotated and translated corpus that's put in an archive. So there are several very large archives that are collecting this kind of material, and that's one view of how that you do documentation. A kind of broader view, and one that I think I would follow, is the idea is to produce records of a language, audio, visual, textual descriptions that are available and stored for general use. Now, revitalisation is any work or effort, anything that we do to increase the vitality of a language. And this could mean either increasing the domains of use. So if the language is only used in the family, for example, it means taking it out of the family, maybe into public domain, maybe for education, maybe for government use, maybe for publishing. And or increasing the number of speakers. And this would mean more adults speaking the language and also more children. This actually is much older than the documentation that I talked about before, and it begins with indigenous communities, including the Maori in New Zealand, who started doing this kind of thing in the 1970s. They were very concerned that their language was not being learnt by children, so they created language nests where they brought grandparents and children together to increase the number of speakers and increase the domains of use. And this is something that speech communities are often much more interested in. They don't want to document their languages, they want to revitalize and support them and develop them. Often it is assumed that revitalization means learning in school, lessons in school or immersion programs or bilingual education. I think this is a big mistake. Actually, if you want to have the language continue, people should be speaking it, not studying it at school necessarily. Now, if we want to study or train future generations of researchers to do documentation and to be involved in revitalization, I think there are many, many skills and a lot of knowledge involved. So it's important to know how to design a project, to work out who are you going to work with, how does the local community operate, to design your project and to manage it. You'll need to know how to apply for some money, whether you apply to UNESCO or the National Science Foundation or other bodies. There are a lot of interpersonal and fieldwork skills. Just being able to to talk to strangers, talk to people you've never met before, understand the different cultural expectations, to live in a situation which is very different from your own. Maybe it's in a jungle in South America or in the deserts of Australia, including looking after your own health and safety. So our students who go to do fieldwork, they need to know, if I get sick, what am I going to do? That kind of thing. Media management, they need to know how to make recordings, how to make video, how to manage that, look after it. Data and metadata management, so using their computers to analyze material, to manage that, to keep track of metadata, which is data about the data. Who is speaking? When was this recorded? What language are they speaking in? Who are the other people who are being spoken to, and so on. They need to do linguistic analysis, phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, all of that kind of linguistic research. Increasingly, they are expected to mobilize their material. That is, the communities that we work with, they want help, they want pedagogy, they want curriculum, they want language policy, they want us to produce materials and to take what we record and turn it into something directly useful to them. Students also need to have team-based skills. They need to know how to share, how to transfer knowledge, how to train other people, how to develop the capacity, how to work with the communities to share their knowledge of research and the studies that they're doing. And finally, they need reporting skills. They have to give presentations, they need to write up their materials, they need to communicate. Often they need to communicate with the local community to explain, this is what I'm here, this is why I'm doing my research, this is why I want to interview you. And at the end of their project, to explain what have they done and so on. Look at this long, huge list of different skills and expectations. Now, if you go to university and you want to study how to document and revitalize languages, basically I'm not sure about here in Catalonia or in Spain, in the universities where I have worked, very few of these skills are actually taught. In fact, a few places have a subject that they call field methods. And if you look at what's covered, it's not that, 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 and that's it. So how do you analyze a language? How do you write about it? That's all they teach. So at SOAS, we offer a specialist degree in documentation and language support and revitalisation. We have a special MA that's designed to cover as many areas that we can. And in our work, we cover things like project design, the students learn how to apply for money, etc. But the two big gaps for us were interpersonal and fieldwork skills, number one, and number two was team-based skills, how to share knowledge, how to work with communities to share. So we were concerned. We were not teaching the students how to go to the field and do all the things there and have all the proper skills for interpersonal relationships and so on, and also how to share that knowledge. Well, very fortunately for us, 4 years ago, the Surma Workers' Centre in Camden, that's about 20 minutes walking from our university, very, very close. This is a community centre that is run by the Sylheti community. These are people who originally came from Bangladesh, and they came to us. They came to us and they said, we are really worried about how Sylheti is being used by our children, especially by third generation. And we want you to help us. We want you to help us document our language and to help us with revitalising it. So the Sylheti is a minority language in Bangladesh. It is called a dialect of Bengali. Bengali is the national language, and in Bengal, in Bangladesh, they consider it to be a dialect. In the same way that somebody might say, oh, Catalan is just a dialect of Spanish. Even though Sylheti and Bengali are not mutually intelligible, people who speak the two languages can't understand each other. You have to learn the other language. So Sylheti is very negatively valued. It's believed to be the country language. It's not written. There's no writing system. It's not used in the media. It's very lowly valued. But 95% of the Bangladeshis in London are speakers of Sylheti, and they were worried what's happening to their language. So our first response was to engage members from the centre to work with us in our field methods course. So when I teach field methods, we work with a speaker that the students of a language the students don't know, and we begin to understand it and try to learn it and work out its structure. And as a result, we now have a large multimedia corpus that was students created with the speaker from the Surma Centre. The second response was an activist project that the students began working with the centre to develop community-based materials. The students went to the centre and they participated in women's exercise groups, This is Islamic community, so the genders are very separated. The boys went and played cards, the girls went and did cooking or exercise groups. They engaged with young people, they started a Facebook page, and they also started Sylheti language classes. So how are we going to start writing this language? How are we going to start teaching it? Okay, so we had two different things happening. One is the Sylheti Project, and that was engaging with the community, studying the language, doing the exercises, going to the centre, the students going to the centre and participating. And then they set up the Sylheti Language Society, which teaches Sylheti at the university. So Sylheti is a real language, just like French and German and Chinese. It's taught at university. And then we had a series of events. We invited community members to come. Many of them had never been to a university before, so they came, they participated in various things. We made videos of food preparation and started working on a dictionary, Sylheti Bengali English. Language classes, lots of networking going on, and we recorded a lot of folk stories. The students did crowdfunding. They went out onto the internet and they begged people for money. Please support us, we want to make this thing. And they were able to raise money to employ an artist, found printers, and they are going to have a big launch event actually next week at the Surma Centre. So they engage with community members to get the practical knowledge and skills going beyond the curriculum, and they created the first ever book in Sylheti, which is this beautiful little book that was just produced, lots of lovely pictures, and this is written in Roman script and also in a Sylheti script with English translation. So the first ever Sylheti book coming out of this collaboration between the students and the community. And in the process, the students learned incredibly valuable skills and knowledge by engaging. And as I said, next week, we're going to have a big launch of this and sort of celebration. So I think a nice example that we haven't stopped there. They're currently working on developing the dictionary, and it's going to be available online. They are starting to make an app for the smartphones, and it will be published as well. So you can see this is the group of students and community members collaborating together. We engage together, and it's cross-fertilization with a positive result. Let me tell you about the second project. This is a collaboration with Warsaw and Leiden. The project is funded by the European Commission, Horizon 2020 Twinning Initiative. It's roughly €1 million over 3 years. And I'm involved with my colleague Julia Salabank from SOAS, along with colleagues in Leiden and in Warsaw. And our main goal is multidisciplinary capacity building, working with the University of Warsaw and indigenous communities. And we want to develop strategies for revitalisation, including new models for curricula and methodologies for teaching minority languages. Our approach to research is what is referred to as participatory action research. It's going out and working directly with participants and engaging with them, and then documenting and recording that participation and that engagement. Participatory action research and also community-based participatory research. Direct participation of communities as stakeholders and partners in our work. And our goal is to create collaborative spaces for marginalized groups in Europe and outside of Europe to conduct research and to explore their own agency, to develop the skills and knowledge they need to work on their own languages and to document and revitalize their own languages and their own cultures. And we have a series of different activities, including seminars and workshops in Poland, in London, and in Leiden. But two major things that have been very different from the usual is running field schools. We have had 2 field schools so far, one in Wilemowice in Poland, and the second is in Tlaxcala in Mexico, which is a Nahuatl-speaking village in Mexico, just south of the capital. Next year we will be doing similar things in the Isle of Man and also in Sami territory in north of Scandinavia. Okay, so there are participants involved in the project from 15 countries working on 22 different languages from around the world. We have Basque speakers and also Catalan speakers engaged in the project. So there's, from Poland, we have people speaking Wimisiewicz, Lemko, Kashubian, and Silesian. This is very revolutionary for Poland. Poland, you probably know, has a very right-wing conservative government that does not recognize minorities. So we are engaging with the minorities in Poland. And these other languages, Sami, Basque, as I mentioned, Sylheti, Nahuatl, and Wapishana from Guyana in South America. Last year we had a summer school in London on transdisciplinarity in documentation and revitalization. So the idea being that you're looking across disciplines and disciplines feeding and supporting each other. And part of this was practical research training on audio recording and linguistic software. And there were speakers, as you can see here, from a range of different backgrounds. In September last year, we ran a field school in Wilemowice. This is a village in the southeastern part of Poland, where a German language is spoken. The community moved there 300 years ago, and they continue to speak their variety, which is a kind of German that's related to Flemish. And they have essentially been persecuted for a major amount of time, particularly during and after the Second World War. Because although the community is long established and has been there a very long time, the local people after the Second World War discriminated against them because they were identified with the Nazi regime. The language was forbidden, the people were not allowed to wear traditional clothing, and it was a huge attempt to stamp it out by the Poles. However, there are still speakers there, and we have been working together with them in international, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic teams to document the local languages, to document the neighboring language spoken in the village of Hatzlov, to look at attitudes from the majority community to see what attitudes the Polish people have, and to develop educational materials in the Vis-à language. So it's a spectacularly beautiful part of Poland, and they have been recovering this heritage which was put under tremendous pressure in the last 60, 70 years. We have a documentary. If you're interested, you can, if you Google Engaged Humanities, you can have a look at the documentary. I won't show it to you here, but this young gentleman here that you see is absolutely amazing. His name is Timek, and when he was 10 years old, he became interested in the language of his grandmother. And he said, "Grandmother, you must teach me how to speak vis-à, I want to learn vis-à." And his parents, he was so enthusiastic, his parents gave him a cassette tape recorder. And Timek interviewed his grandmother and aunts and uncles and so on. He's now 23 years old. He has 1,000 hours of recordings of all the generations, and has been very much engaged in revitalising and reteaching this language. So he's an activist, and began, as I said, as a school child at the age of 10. They have produced a series of plays in vis-à, The Hobbit, and they were able to perform at the National Theatre in Warsaw. So this is bringing vis-à out of the home into the public domain and performing it and showing that it's a real language and so on. We have other videos. So there's a young woman who's 16, and she has been translating songs into vis-à, Justin Bieber songs, and she has an absolutely spectacular voice and has been performing and singing and doing public performances. So she is 16, her sister is 13, and they have a sort of a family group. And this has very much engaged the teenagers and younger people in the village, and now the language is really cool because you can sing Justin Bieber in vis-à. Okay, this year we did a summer school in Leiden. We had participants from all over the place, including a number from Latin America. And there were some exciting aspects to this. So, for example, here is Carlos from Mexico, and he's presenting a talk about his work in Ayok, which is his indigenous language. So here we have a speaker of a minority endangered language from Mexico giving a presentation at a major international university. And that's the kind of thing of bringing these languages into the public and showing that you can speak Ayuk and talk about university-level topics as much as use it in the home. We did hands-on methodological workshops. So part of our work has been looking at ethnobotanical studies. That is, how do we talk about the botany? And there's a beautiful botanical garden, actually, at University of Leiden. So we did a tour of the botanical garden, different speakers of different languages talking about how you discuss the plants and so on, working also with specialists in botany. Okay, so it's transdisciplinary, bringing together indigenous people, linguists, anthropologists, and botanists, and so on. Part of the summer school was a poster display and documentary films. Thank you. Okay, just a month or so ago, we had the Mexican Field School, which was in Tlaxcala. This is a small village just southeast of Mexico City, and that's the people who live there speak Nahuatl, indigenous language of Mexico, and the field school involved working together with them to learn skills and knowledge and prepare materials, and particularly for documenting the local culture. And the goal was to have transfer of knowledge in both directions, from the Europeans and the outsiders who came, and also the local Nahuatl speakers. There were several other indigenous groups in Mexico represented, including Mixe, Mayan, and Mixteco. So it wasn't just the local people, it was also a broader indigenous representation. And they focused a lot on cultural documentation, weaving, and local activities. Linguistic heritage, they looked at language attitudes, the use of theatre for language revitalisation, so taking models from Poland and seeing if they could be adapted to Mexico. And focusing also on community well-being, the health and welfare aspects of language and cultural revitalisation. So what are the impacts? What are some of the outcomes, the sort of significant things? Well, a big one for us is that there is now a plan for a living museum in Wilemowice. This has been approved following our field school, and the local authorities have a plan to build a living museum which will engage the local community. Also exciting was that the Polish Parliamentary Commission that was established for study of national and ethnic minorities. They held a special session in the town of Wilemowice during our field school, and we were able to go and meet with the Polish parliamentarians and explain to them what's going on. And earlier this year, in May this year, Wimosiewicz was finally recognized as a minority language of Poland. So we believe this is connected to, partly connected to our own work and our engagement with the community and working with the Parliamentary Commission. The University of Warsaw has established a new international centre for research and practice in cultural continuity. There's a range of collaborations going on. They're very, very keen to collaborate with other organisations and individuals. So if you would like to be involved, you can contact Warsaw, and I'm sure that they will be really happy to reach out and to work together on research and practice in cultural continuity. Warsaw has also been successful in getting two further large projects. Use the notion of language as a cure, using it as a tool for psychological well-being, health and economic sustainability. So we know, for example, in minority and indigenous communities that the level of suicide for young people is very, very high. We have studies in Canada, United States, Australia that show that 1 in 3 young people kill themselves before they become 20. And this psychological pressure that they are placed under is just enormous. What the research also shows that if you have a language and culture program, the suicide rate drops enormously. It also is beneficial for people's health, heart disease, diabetes, and so on. There is a clear connection. This is not just talk, this is actually empirically established. A clear connection between cultural and linguistic vitality and human vitality in terms of psychological and physical health. And the Polish colleagues are extending this. They have just got a budget of another €1 million to work on extending this. And a second project working on community engagement and education. So how can you get involved? Engage with us. Become a part of our Engaged Humanities. We have a workshop in January in SOAS. There will be field schools on the Isle of Man and at Kautokeino in Norway. Kautokeino is a university which is run by the Sami people, and they teach their courses in the Sami language, and that's the Northern Sami language. If you'd like to know more about that, get in touch with us, and we will be having a field school there in 2018 and further training workshops. So to summarize, the experience of the Sylheti Project at SOAS and the Engaged Humanities Project shows us that community engagement can have very positive effects and benefits inside academic studies, inside universities, and also outside. There are opportunities for different kinds of training and learning. So our students have learnt enormous amounts of knowledge and skill by learning to interact with the Sylheti community, going there and saying, okay, we're going to document your language, and then suddenly realizing, actually, that's not what they want. They want different agendas, and there was a lot of negotiation and discussion. So the students learnt how to do that by the very process. It was somewhat painful at times, but it was good learning for them. Valorization within communities and the wider society. Let me give you an example. The Census Department in the UK has just decided to do a study which involves interviews with community members. And they produced some questionnaires. And they said, right, we are going to ask the people from Bangladesh. And they translated all the questionnaires into Bengali. Of course, they discovered that when they did some testing, that nobody could understand these things. They couldn't read them, they couldn't make sense of them. And they then actually came to us and said, what's the problem? What's going on here? And we said, well, actually, they speak Sylheti, which is a totally different language. You need to go back to the beginning and start over again. So now the Sylheti community says, we have a real language. We can read it, we can write it, we've got books in it, we've got stories, etc. So that's valorization for them, recognition. We've started working on preparing language support and revitalisation materials and engaged in international networking of academics and community members. Thank you very much. There will be a chance for questions at the end. Thank you.
There will be the opportunity to raise questions at the end of both presentations. Now I have the honor to introduce Professor Ostler. You have his curriculum in the handout in English. Professor Ostler es va formar en llengües clàssiques, filosofia i economia a la Universitat d'Oxford i va obtenir un doctorat en lingüística del MIT, del Massachusetts, de l'Institut de Tecnologia de Massachusetts. Ha ensenyat lingüística a la Universitat del Japó, a Turquia, a Kazakhstan, així com en el SOAS, en aquesta escola d'estudis orientals i africans de Londres.
School of Oriental and
Des del 1995 va fundar
African Studies in London. He founded the Foundation for Endangered Languages, a charity based in England and Wales, and he has written 4 well-known works: Empires of the World, A Language History of the World in 2005, Ad Infinitum, a biography of Latin, The Last Lingua Franca, The Rise and Fall of World Languages, and Passwords to Paradise, how languages have reinvented world religions. So let's welcome him, and
well, thank
he
you.
will
I'm
take
not
the
quite
floor.
sure where I stand at the moment, or indeed whether I sit or I stand. I haven't got the display of the PowerPoint yet, and I don't have the means to control it if I do. Oh, we've come up now. All right, well, now I'm here. I may as well continue from here. Let me just see if I know how to work the... No, that doesn't work. That's it. Good, right. Let me start by saying thank you very much to the Linguapax organization, and specifically to Alicia Fuentes-Calle for inviting me to tell you a little bit about my point of view on this great world of languages and how they interrelate. I was rather inspired, I must say, by what Peter Austin has just been telling us, seeing how much progress is being made in integrating work on language documentation and implicitly language revitalisation with the communities which we hope are positive about their languages, wish to flourish in them, and to actually get their point of view on it and do this work basically in all the four corners of the world. So that is very inspiring, particularly when I'm wearing my endangered languages hat, which I'm not wearing at the moment. I believe this seminar that we are having today focuses especially on relations between languages, and as I will talk about it, the role of lingua francas in mediating those relations. There is a big human world out there, and that human world relies on a variety of different languages. But often people want to do things, they want to have relationships across language barriers. And what I want to talk about here is think about how lingua francas fit into that range of language barriers which there are, and the kind of bridges that there are across them. It's quite a complex field. So my talk, by contrast with Peter's, which was mostly about societies and how they relate to their languages, my talk is far more about how different languages can be bridged, what the relationships are between these different language systems, and how to optimize that. I'm still getting to know it. It's 7 years ago now, my book, The Last Lingua Franca, came out. And that book was different, of course, for every reader. My literary agent wanted it to be a book about English. I wanted it to be a book about Persian and Pali and a number of other languages which have played an important role as lingua francas. German, I remember, was an important thing, and the way that the developments leading up to the Second World War led, in, among other things, to the subversion of German, which had been a great scientific lingua franca, and effectively denied it that role. So the point about lingua francas is that it's not only at the global level that one has lingua francas, and that lingua francas are not the only way of bridging the gaps and difficulties of communication which occur among languages. There is a fair amount about English in this book, The Last Lingua Franca, so my agent was partially happy, having the view that only books about English are the ones which sell in the world. But the important point for me was that the future probably does not lie with English as a lingua franca. At the moment, English is very dominant in terms of international communication in international bodies. But my perhaps perverse, but to some extent historically based prediction was that we will not expect in the long run English to retain this role. So my prediction was that something in the form of technical translation, machine translation, is going to become increasingly important in the relationship between languages, and that different languages will remain because people actually glory in them. They see them as a celebration of their own identity and what they have effectively to contribute as nations, as peoples, as groups to world culture and their own culture. Interlingual technology, however, will not inherit the ethical problems of using a lingua franca. And the idea is that in this new world where the technical bridges can be built, it will ultimately be a more egalitarian world in the sense that the bridges between languages can be built anywhere. Why do I have this? I have this concept of peak English that we have at the moment. People talk of peak oil as the time that oil consumption in the world is at its highest. It's never going to be higher than it is now. It's going to go down in the future. Similarly, English, although all the trends have seen English increase itself, nevertheless, there will come a time when it reaches its peak. And the fact is that the various forces, which we all know about, which have put English in its position in the world today, on the British Empire, that is, the triumph of American-style capitalism, one could say, around the world, and the important role that Anglo-Saxon nations have played in scientific and technological development, are all things which are which we are very much aware of, but which are now essentially in the past. We would expect the future to be determined by things which are going on now, rather than what has happened and has put us where we are. Inevitably, however, people tend to be short-sighted. What I do find, I think, and we will see this, is that lingua franca English is not being taken up as a mother tongue in families. What essentially made for the success of the Romance languages in Western Europe is the fact that people switched from using Latin as a lingua franca in the Roman Empire to actually passing it on to their children. And so the Celtic languages, which has been spoken over most of Western Europe, have gone away. That phenomenon, perhaps you would say it's too early to say at the moment, but doesn't seem to be happening in English. People are picking it up as a lingua franca, but they're continuing to live their own lives in their own languages. There's a reason why people don't want to switch to lingua francas. It's because lingua francas tend to be spoken by minorities in society who are not necessarily dominant forever. Lingua francas therefore become associated with elites and lose popularity. And the other thing about lingua francas is that they are, after all, languages which need to be learnt. Whereas you don't need to learn anything, to do anything, to apply language technology. If it's available, you will see it works automatically, and it doesn't impose an extra burden on the people who speak. What we're going to need, however, in order to develop this language technology is an increasing use of effectively language documentation, language resources, which enable us to see other languages for what they are and how they relate to other languages, whether through translation or stylistic relationships, which can all be used in language technology systems. And this sort of information is going to grow for all the languages, not just the big beasts, the big languages beside English. This is what I use that term for in my book. The actual tendency in internet growth is for smaller languages to grow faster, though from a smaller base, than the large ones. So at the moment, surprisingly enough, it seems that diversity is increasing rather than decreasing. Anyway, and that's the general introduction, so to speak. It's a rather long introduction. Here we have what I identify as the 5 different ways that you can get across the language barrier. You can have bilingual interpreters. You can have another language which is used, and that's the lingua franca. You can try to make the problem go away by systematically translating texts that you are interested in. So that means you can continue working in your own language, having a translation of any other text that interests you. You can have a special analysis of the languages involved so as to teach people the languages that they need to learn. Or, and the third and the most recent is the development of machine translation, which will lead on to automatic interpreting. We're already seeing it now. So those are 5 different conceptual ways you could get over language barriers. And in fact, historically, this is the order in which we find them in world language history. There have been bilingual interpreters for as long as there have been human languages. Obviously, we don't know about the very early stages of human language, but the world, as we project it back, is a multilingual one. And there were always people who belonged to more than one community, whether through intermarriage or through traveling around, or indeed harsher things like war between communities. A lingua franca, on the other hand, is effectively the product of the era of great empires, when people were no longer primarily hunter-gatherers, but were organized into agricultural communities which made war on each other, and some won and some lost. The result was the languages of the ones which won and took over tended to grow, and we get then the beginning of lingua francas all the way back to Sumerian, say, but certainly the ones we think of recently, like Latin or Persian in the West Asia, are all ultimately the result of imperialist activity, supplemented with trade and indeed religious conversions. The systematic translation approach comes into its own with the people trying to learn how to be good Buddhists all around southern and eastern Asia. And so that starts from the first millennium AD, really. Language analysis for teaching is a new theoretical, it's the contribution of science to this field, the first contribution of science to this field, which comes about, it started in this particular part of the world, indeed, with the works of Nebrija, who was a contemporary of Ferdinand and Isabel at the beginning of the Spanish Empire. Indeed, he offered his grammar book to Queen Isabel before there was a single Spanish colony in the New World. What people were going to do was realize that each language can have a grammar and can have a lexicon, not just the classical languages, the old lingua francas, Latin and Greek, but all the languages are capable of doing this, especially if they aspire, he was thinking, to imperialism. So that was a development which meant that intellectuals started to realize what the language diversity of the world was and how the different languages differed from each other. And machine translation, the fifth of these, including automatic interpreting, really comes in the late 20th century. It's a very recent development with us. I don't think people would have predicted it, even in the 19th century. Well, as it happens, all these things work, they've all been used, but all of them have different problems of their own. The bilingual interpreter approach, and here we can see Malinche serving as a bilingual interpreter between the Aztecs and the conquering Spanish. In fact, they needed two bilingual interpreters because Malinche did not know Spanish, but she knew both Nahuatl and Mayan. There was another Spaniard with them who knew Mayan because he had been marooned in a Mayan village for 10 years, and then there were the Spanish who only knew Spanish, of course. That at least has not changed. First of all, it takes you time to develop the staff of bilingual interpreters if you've got a project which you want. In this case, that time lapse was supplied by the Spanish person who had involuntarily spent 10 years in a Mayan village. You need to have the person on site when it is slow, and there are other human factors having to do with romance, one might also say, which complicate the general situation. That certainly happened all across Central America under Spanish conquest. When you have a lingua franca, which is the presumption in this situation is that languages are not equal, and that basically the language of the conquering people is better than the language of other people. So there is this association with imperial powers, which in some eras is popular, in other eras, perhaps our own, and it becomes less popular. And it puts people off wanting to learn the relevant language. And the third thing is that, as I said, a lingua franca is a language, and so there is a burden on learners. We want the mass translation of texts is where you have vast numbers of ordered scholars, monks, typically working on Buddhist texts in the early stage, and providing the content to the people speaking the other language. It's a process of decoding. It usually only happened because a king or an empire was prepared to get the thing organized, because it's difficult to organize administratively, but it costs a lot to keep everybody working. You need centralization for this to work. And since you're only translating one text at a time, inevitably the results are limited. You could go on translating them, but it ultimately doesn't enable you to have random access to the content of other people's languages. Language analysis for teaching problems, and here we can see Nebrija in his classroom in 16th century Spain. It requires linguists, it requires scientists to actually get into the language and work out how they work. So a theoretical understanding of grammar is required. And then you've got to train people, and this is the sort of thing effectively that Peter was just talking about, to be interpreters, users of a lingua franca, or translators. The most recent one, machine translation and automatic interpreting, has problems of its own. Firstly, because since this is an inanimate machine which is doing the thing, it won't realize, without being told, that it's got things wrong. You get imperfect outcomes which pass. It needs to keep its lexicon up to date. It has lots and lots of problems with incorporating proper names and working out the different kinds of language and how they interact with each other. Different languages are structured in different ways, which means that parsing is not a solved problem in a general sense. And then understanding what people meant, what they're getting at, what the allusions are, is also, these are the problems which we have become familiar with at the end of the 20th and early 21st century. Nevertheless, it does see that as a computer program throws more and more theoretical weight at these things, the problems are diminishing. I won't say they all solved, certainly not as yet. Now, what I wanted to do with it is just to give you some idea of how these different solutions relate to each other. That's why I call it a graphical approach. Here you can see language L, in language M. Some people in those two language communities, in a way, the circles that you're going to see each represent a community, they overlap because some people are in both communities. And their capabilities in the intersection of those two groups can be used. But it means that pre-existing bilingualism, and you don't know where that comes from, but it is a necessary condition for any interpreting to take place. One sort of degenerate case in that is if one of the languages is much smaller as a community than the other one, and furthermore has most of its speakers in the bilingual group. This is a case which is ripe for language endangerment, because people will tend to be, the speakers of language M will tend to be bullied by speakers of language L, and people will say, well, why do we need this language anyway? It just gets in the way. And the fact that there are some people who are not in language L who speak language M tends to be increasingly ignored, aggressively ignored. And that's what I see as a major cause of language endangerment. However, a lingua franca does give a useful typology to language communities. It makes it clear which language to learn to maximize access. So in the world at the moment, when people are setting up educational policies, which language shall we teach? It's essentially a no-brainer question. If you want to give people international competence in the world at the moment, you will teach them English. Of course, that doesn't tell you what language you should teach in the United States of America, or in Britain, or Australia. And the result is that they tend to say, oh, well, they're all going to learn our language anyway, so we won't bother learning anybody's. I use the term lingua franca to mean a language which is learned consciously and deliberately. So it's a language of policy, whereas a mother tongue is a language that you learn not because you've chosen to do so, but because you grow up in a given family or in a given area. But the lingua franca is learned deliberately. You get some other interesting cases where, in a way, nobody speaks the lingua franca, but everybody speaks a dialect of it. This is the concept of diglossia, which Ferguson popularized in studies of Arabic, which is famous as a language which is spoken in dialects, but is only really written, and to some extent in technical international broadcasting used in its own right. So it's almost as if there's a gap in where the language should be. One of the problems, I mentioned it early on, with the problem with lingua franca is that it does tend to generate elites. There are people who speak the lingua franca, and there are usually a majority of people who speak the other languages who don't speak it. It's interesting that the term English-speaking elite, if you look it up on Google, has a meaning and a reference all over the world at different communities, but it is not to be found in the United States of America or Canada, or indeed in the UK. We somehow don't realize, we think that people, when they speak our languages abroad, are simply doing it for utility, not because they want to be someone, i.e. someone who knows the language, as against the people who don't. But this is increasingly, I think, a problem for lingua francas, and can lead to hostility, especially if there are significant barriers to acquiring the lingua franca, or the lingua franca group itself is unpopular with other lingua speakers. One place where this was very painfully felt was Sri Lanka. in the very south of South Asia, where the Tamil community, who were not native speakers of English at all, nevertheless became the experts on English. And this meant that the majority, who were Sinhala speakers, felt that they were in some sense disenfranchised in their own country and started fighting back in the most literal sense, so that we had a long-lasting war between the Tamils and the Sinhala communities, which at some level, indirectly, was about English. We've seen the use of large-scale translation programs, which has an early history with the Chinese. There are all these different texts. The texts are in square boxes and the communities are in round ones. They were getting the languages, getting texts which were written in Pali, in Gandhari, and latterly in Sanskrit too, all related languages, but not related to Chinese, and the Chinese were the ones who wanted to read them. So they had to go around trying to find bilingual people who would then translate the texts. And this is what we have. We have many of the Buddhist texts are only known because they were translated at a particular date by the Chinese. So we know what that date is. So we know that that text must have predated that era. But with the texts in their own right, written in Gandhari, Pali, or Sanskrit, are of unknown date. In a way, we have the converse activity taking place in the Americas in the early days of the Spanish Empire, where people had taught themselves these other languages, such as Nahuatl or Quechua, Chibcha, various languages, and they said, we've got all these brilliant texts which are actually only available in Latin or Spanish. We want you to know them. And so to some extent, they translated a subset of the Christian scriptures into other languages and discussed them with them. But effectively, they did not create literate communities in those other languages. To some extent, there was the content of the Christian message got across, but it was very much a partial result. But for that to happen, we had to have something which Sylvain Auroux has called la grammatisation, which is something which happened as a technological advance in the 16th century in Europe, was people realized that every language has a grammar, every language has a lexicon, and you can mass produce bilinguals by implementing that knowledge. A grammar of L, a vocabulary of L, and of course, this is the ultimate source of that holy trinity of descriptive linguistics from the early 20th century, which was very commonly taught in American linguistics departments then, that for every language you need a grammar, a vocabulary, and a set of texts. Once you get into language technology, in effectively any sort of relationship can be implemented, perhaps not directly. And so that's what this diagram seeks to show, is that there is interaction between texts in different languages, language L, language M, but there are also interactions between the speech in L and the text in L, and that's another solved problem which needs to be organized. And to some extent, this exposes the artificiality, perhaps, of the representation of languages, which is seen in written versions of them. We tend to assume that everything that can be said can be written, and that everything, that the message in a written text can just be generated as speech in another language, perhaps. Well, to some extent this is true, but we see there are difficulties in that. Well, that's sort of the graphical section, which is over, suggesting how these different concepts are related to each other in terms of what they do. In the world as it happens, we need to say, well, what alternatives are there to English as an lingua franca? One possibility would be that other languages will step up as English perhaps steps down. And what we see in this map of the world's major lingua francas, so effectively of languages which are spoken more widely than national boundaries, is that there are something like 7 or 8 alternatives to English, which we could imagine might increase their role as English, for one reason or another, diminishes. The one which is closest to, you can see the English there is represented in purple. The language which is closest in coverage, geographical coverage to English is French, which is the dark blue you can see on here, and which is the only language, only lingua franca besides English, which is not regionally concentrated. Even Spanish, which results very much from the activities of the Spanish imperialists in the 16th and 17th centuries, is now concentrated along the Pacific coast of Central and South America. But the other major languages which we can see here, and which whose uses are seen here, are very much concentrated on particular areas. This means that their use as a global language is prima facie going to be harder than what happened with English or conceivably with French. What we can already see, however, is that these languages, even where they are not really contenders yet as global languages, might be beginning to be less interested in the languages which are global. And I allude here to some statistical results that the Pew organization, which does global surveys, did from their view of Chinese, which they surveyed in 2002 and 2008. One of the questions that they asked Chinese, very widespread, is, do children need to learn English to succeed in the world today? And what they found was that when they did it in 2002, over 90% of Chinese said yes, and indeed it was around 2002 that English became universal in language classrooms across China. However, after another 6 years of experience, they were asked this question again. And interestingly, although obviously they still, by and large, the consensus was that children should be taught English, fewer people were thinking that English was what was needed. So what's interesting about this chart is the direction of play. Is instead of people, as a result of knowing more English, thought that they needed even more English, they thought they needed less. I have another talk which I go on at some length to say how much the economic changes which have taken place in the world in the late 20th century, early 21st century, are changing the language marketplace. So in a way, it's not irrational for the Chinese to see themselves increasingly as the center of the world, and that the world will be economically dominated by Chinese enterprise, maybe, in a way that we can only imagine in the past for American enterprise. These things are going to happen. We don't know how quickly they're going to happen or the order in which things will happen, but the fact that the global economic crash in 2008 was basically a Western and Anglo-Saxon phenomenon, and much less a phenomenon in China, begins to show how other parts of the world are beginning to assume leadership roles. And this will happen linguistically. One thing that people have taken comfort for in the world of lingua franca analysis is to say, well, maybe English as spoken by the British, and especially the Americans, and perhaps Australians, is not going to be central anymore. But that doesn't mean that English itself is going to go away. We're going to get something which I have called Wimbledonized English. People talk about Wimbledonization. I don't know how many in the audience have ever heard of Wimbledonization? relatively few people. This possibly would be because you are not financiers. It's a phrase which has become common in the financial world, and perhaps will be increasingly common after Brexit, in that just as Wimbledon traditionally provided the most competitive and in some sense the most exciting world competition in tennis in the world, but strangely enough, the nation who hosted this competition never won it. And as things have moved on a little bit, we have we're now beginning to see British victors in both women's and men's tennis, but this is what the concept comes to, that for something like 40 years, there were no national winners in Wimbledon. Nevertheless, Wimbledon went on being the center of world tennis. So the idea is that you would have a playing field provided by the historic originators. The majority of players, and the preeminent ones as well, come from somewhere else, including Switzerland in the case of tennis. The standard of lingua franca no longer provided by historic mother tongue speakers. So in a way, people will say, no, we're going to decide what English is. You guys who speak it natively, get in line and we'll tell you what English is. In general, this approach, it was exactly what happened in the last centuries of Latin, that Latin was very much taken over by Central, Eastern, Northern Europe as Western Europeans and indeed Italians switched away from Latin. Minorities tend to like this sort of Wimbledonizing solution. What I was rather taken with it at some point, so I looked at the equivalent words in Japanese, which is Wimbledonka, or Wimbledonghua in Chinese, Wimbledonisierung in German, Wimbledonisation. And you can see there are these equivalents available in all these different languages, including Arabic and Portuguese, but it is more popular in the East than anywhere else. So the Japanese are the ones who lead with the popularity of this term, the Chinese next. As far as I know, it hasn't particularly caught on in the 7 years since the last lingua franca came out as a discussion, as a means of the debate in lingua francas, but I live in hope. This is what I just wanted to, when I said that that Wimbledonization of language is likely unpopular with big speakers, I was just thinking in the decline of languages. The Latin decline, which I talk about in another book of mine, Ad Infinitum, was led by dominant nations who had languages of their own and preferred to communicate with other speakers of their own language than the world as a whole. This was with French, and essentially the charge was led by René Descartes. And in English too, all this happening in the second half of the 17th century. They were resisted by the speakers of peripheral or latecomer languages, so German or Hungarian in Austria went on using Latin as a language of administration well into the early 19th century. Polish and Lithuanian and the speakers of Nordic and Scandinavia also preferred to use Latin than to use French, which was what they were offered as another international alternative, simply because Latin appeared to have no political strings attached. What the thing is that this sort of situation can only be broken by a large single nation. So you could imagine the Chinese could break the stranglehold, say, of Wimbledonized English in a way that a more obviously international country and multilingual country, say, as Switzerland, would not be able to do. In the same way, say that when you have another international organization like the Euro, certainly the Euro could go away, but it would only go away if the Germans decided that they didn't want to use it anymore. And then the little economies which are using it would gradually follow suit or go somewhere else. But it would not be possible for any of those small communities to unilaterally get out of it. So I would suggest then that in English-speaking hegemony is not secure and other big beasts may be more used as lingua francas. But challenges are regional, they are not global, and conquest, one at least hopes, the most powerful long-term spreader of mother tongues in human history, seems unlikely in the current stage of human development, and not least because having the weapons is to some extent just having the money to pay for the weapons, and it's known, well, global news means that people know what other countries' policies are much more quickly. I mean, it's not possible for parts of the world to be sort of snuck up on in the way that India was ambushed by unexpected invasions, first from the French and then the British, because there was no global exchange of news back in the 18th century. What we are seeing, and this is just a sort of harbinger, is a growth in the easy availability of language technology. Here I've given the example of machine translation, which shows up in Google, and you can see from in the 3 years from 2008 to 2011, the number of language pairs which are serviced by Google multiplied by 5. It's in the 5-6 years since 2011, it hasn't gone up so much. We haven't had another 5-fold increase. We've had, however, something like a doubling, so that there are now 110 different language. I said language pairs just then, but what I should have said languages. So effectively, all these languages can give the impression of interlingual approach, but there are 110 languages which take part in this exchange now. So it's still growing, but maybe the surge is at least temporarily put off. So, crucial questions for the future English. Is English, where it is used in lingua franca, being passed on as a mother tongue? I contend, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, that we are not seeing the phenomenon that Latin saw, whereby people adopted it as their mother tongue and hence led to the growth of the Neo-Latin, the Romance languages. And in a place like a very multilingual country like South Africa, although English is widely known and used, my contention is that, which was contested, I may say, at breakfast this morning, that those people who use English are not inclined to use it more in their own families and therefore pass it on to the next generation that way. Are the English-speaking elites growing? Certainly they are, especially as universities increasingly use English in their courses. But again, there are some breaks on that. The Dutch tried to do that formally about 15 years ago and were forced to row back and go back because of the pride of the Dutch people in the Dutch language, and they didn't want to see it giving up on elite roles such as university teaching. Is lingua franca English taking over functional domains from other mother tongues? It doesn't seem to be the case that it is. If anything, it's the other countries which are gradually building their own capabilities. And we were given an example of a minority language speaker in Mexico claiming effectively higher role, higher functions for his language in Peter's talk this morning. Other branches to the language barrier becoming more or less viable? Well, we just have to see. I mean, there are these other ways of getting the effect of access to foreign language material. The 5 that I listed are still available to anybody. But I think that ultimately the social role of languages is going to triumph. People are going to go on using their own languages, but increasingly finding that less a problem in getting other people who speak other languages to understand it. So in a sense, if I may take from the sad example of my own country with Brexit, the world's languages are in a position to have their cake and eat it too. So thank you very much.
Well, we have half an hour for comments or questions on these two talks. Any, please? You can introduce yourself if you can.
Oh. Yeah, so my name is Matthias Brenzinger. I'd like to comment not on what you just mentioned about the spread of English as a mother tongue in South Africa, but on more widely, I thought your talk is very interesting, but it's a very Eurocentric way of defining the discourse, because lingua franca in Africa, as Bernd Heine defined them many years ago, they're used by speakers speaking different languages, and they're equal. They're just the opposite of what you claim. So languages like Swahili are spoken by majorities, and they are leveling the communities instead of creating elites. And the same is with Lingala and smaller lingua francas like Lozi, and they became mother tongue. You see? So they spread as mother tongues. And since 1/3 of the world's languages are spoken on the African continent, this is something we need to consider when we talk about language diversity globally. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you. I'm sure you're absolutely right in what you talk about, but you will agree with me that the exceptional nature of Africa is always an embarrassment to global linguistic studies. I think that's right. The Africans retain the ability to teach us a lot of different things that are going on in a relatively small compass in small communities in Africa and how they relate to each other. Nevertheless, I think that, and I do think that this elitist association of lingua francas has been a feature of the ones which have taken global roles, whether they are English as in most recently, but more distantly, in the case of Latin and Spanish, for example, these and French. These are languages which were spread imperialistically, and of course there was a hierarchy which was implicit in that. Perhaps I've been wrong in saying this has had to do with the institution of a lingua franca as such, and you may be right that you could have equal lingua francas. In fact, the idea that lingua francas could be equal is implicit in the fact that English is being taught all around the world. The idea is everybody should learn it, not just an elite. But certainly, traditionally, it has been an elite acquisition, and something which has made the world's interpersonal relationships less good than they could otherwise have been.
Any more questions or comments?
I have two questions for both speakers. Let's start with Peter Austin. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very enriching, and it's interesting to see what is going on in terms of involvement of universities and communities working together. I was very impressed what you said at Vienna, and maybe you could a little bit elaborate what the work what you have done as academic with local community made an impact at political level and policy level in Poland, recognizing a minority language which was not recognized before. So what do you think, what are the key factors, what played really this radical shift of recognizing a minority language in Poland? The second question, what I have, it's addressed to Nicholas Ostler, was very enriching as well, very interesting to reflect about lingua franca. And I would like to refer to the map what you used to show those lingua francas around the world. And we could see it countries like Russian Federation, China, will look like a very big beast. And historically, those languages are used around the world, and we are increasingly taught in different countries like Chinese, but at the same time, we know that those countries are not monolingual. There are so many linguistic minorities and many other, let's say, in China, we could say dialects or languages spoken. So do you see what, as a Chinese, as a one-language Mandarin, could still be considered as a lingua franca, knowing that in those countries there are so many linguistic minorities living. So in reality, we speak about only one language spoken in China, and which probably has more exposure globally than many other ones.
Any comment?
I'm afraid the acoustics in here are difficult. Not sure that I got exactly what your question was. Was it something about validation of amongst the local community, or?
So what are we basically, I was impressed, but academic work made an influence on policy level, and you kind of said what it contributed to the recognition of minority language in Poland. So what are the factors, what you think you could share with us, which played a role and influence with
Which were the factors that led to recognition? Okay. I think it was really the voices of the people from the community that this commission, which came from Warsaw down to this little village, I think it was a very new thing for them to realize that there were actually people who spoke the local languages, who wanted to keep them going and who were very keen to do so. But they were particularly impressed by the stories about the history, what had happened historically, how the community and the people had been treated, particularly after the Second World War. I mean, I don't know if you realize, but I guess you've heard of Auschwitz, the death camps that the Nazis operated. After the war, the Polish communist government continued to operate Auschwitz, and they moved speakers of Imsiewicz and Lemko to those camps. And speakers of Lemko were also sent to Siberia in order to destroy the communities, to break them up, to kill off the local language and culture. This is quite shocking when you hear it, that Auschwitz was continued to be used by the communists. And I think many of the Poles never knew this. They don't know this. This history has been hidden, has been forgotten. So when the Commission heard about some of this history and they met the people who, as children, had been put through this, it really made a big meaning for them. So telling the stories, telling the human biography, showing the significance in terms of well-being, psychological well-being, health well-being, that persuaded the committee that this is a real language, it has real people, it has a real history, and it should be recognized. So that's one particular case study, but we're finding similar kinds of things elsewhere, that it's a case of giving a voice to these communities and allowing them a space to share their history and their cultural experiences. Nick? Yes,
on the question of the linguistic status of Chinese, I mean, people tend to think of it as well, obviously it is a mother tongue of a vast number of people in China, but a lot of people who grow up in China learn their Chinese at school, and it is, according to my definition of a lingua franca, very much a language that people learn deliberately in order to participate in a wider world. So, so Chinese, by which we mean Goryu or Mandarin is already a lingua franca in my terms. It may not be very much learnt outside the boundaries of the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, but it may be more learnt in the future. People tend to see certain phonetic properties of Chinese, in particular its use of a tone system and its very traditional use of an ideographic writing system as two features which make it unsuitable as a more widely spread lingua franca. But that's really only a construct of the relative success of Western powers in the last 400 or 500 years. I mean, there's a reason why Chinese has tones, and it's because it's easier to, when you're losing your consonants, to distinguish words tonally than to lose the distinction altogether. So tones are easy in the same way as an ideographic script is useful in some ways to get meaning across when perhaps phonetically your own vernacular is rather different from that of a writer. So I don't think that the Chinese are in any way an exception to this, and we may well see that with the greater use of icons, which would certainly, you could see the spread of emoji as sort of comparable to Chinese characters, that in the future, the political power, political and economic power of China may be manifested linguistically. It'll take a bit of time for that to happen and perhaps for more recognition to come of how important the Chinese, but I don't see that in the long term their status will be any different from the language of another growing power. I mean, people say, well, doesn't a lingua franca have to be, in some sense, a simple language, otherwise it's not so easy to learn? Well, you can tell that to the Greeks, or rather to the non-Greeks who were using Greek from the 3rd century BC into the 1st millennium AD, all the way across from trade in the Mediterranean to agriculture and trade in the east, right across to what is now Pakistan. Greek was, and recognizable Greek, proper grammatical Greek, was being used in all those parts of the world. It's just a question of need rather than any phonological or systematic property of a lingua franca which makes it usable.
Més intervencions? Davant.
Well, very, very interesting speeches. I was thinking about this, the form of applying the new technologies to the translation of languages. And does that mean there's going to be on our iPhone an app that we can press it and then start talking, for example, in Sylheti, and then suddenly find the translation in Bengali or in English? Is it possible? I think that's really science fiction. I mean, when will that happen? That will need a great capacity for the iPhone to be able to translate so many languages. I see that recently there are some apps where you can find speakers of mother tongue. When you're traveling, you can find someone, you're in China, you can find someone who speaks Spanish, for example. You can find that on an app now. But I don't know, is that feasible in the future, in the near future? And I was thinking about maybe Esperanto. Why don't give it a second chance, second opportunity, since it's becoming so lively on internet?
Yes, well, it's very easy, as I've discovered, to make predictions about the future. You simply say with anything that hasn't happened, you say, well, it hasn't happened yet. And what we are seeing, for example, it seemed, for example, in the early 2000s that the kind of statistical approach which required pre-existing bilingual texts coming from international organizations, that kind of statistical approach was running out of data, and that it almost got as far as it could go. However, digital media developed new means of recording and cheaper means of recording and vaster means of recording, and the number of people who are involved in doing it grows exponentially as well, so that people all over, even Africa, have mobile phones, so that maybe they will at last start to participate in global trends and maybe even lead them. So that suddenly we see there was some sort of major improvement in the quality of the machine translation available in the early 2010s. Now, I think I used to be involved in that field. I'm not involved actively or even as a witness in it at the moment. But I certainly think it's very difficult at any given stage to say that the technology has gone so far and it will go no further. The nature of that may well one day happen with digital technology, but it doesn't seem to have happened recently. So I do think, yes, that ultimately language, probably Sylheti is quite close to the front of the queue for a language which will be available electronically, automatically. Because after all, it's spoken in a language, in a country which has been literate for longer than most parts of the world, where there's higher education, where there are also there's greater consciousness of the social differentiation, as there wasn't perhaps in the past, and as Peter was talking about. So I do think that those things are going to happen, but they haven't happened yet.
If I can just make a comment. It depends which languages you're talking about, which pairs of languages. So if you look at Google Translate, between English and Spanish, it's not too bad. And there's now speech synthesis. If you go to the Google Translate site, you can, if you get your Spanish, let's say I'm here in Barcelona and I want to say something in Spanish, I can find it, translate it, and then press the play button, and it will actually synthesize and produce something which sounds reasonably okay to native speakers. So that's true for Spanish, English Spanish, let's say, Chinese English. The quantities of material that they're basing it on is now so large that the accuracy is really increasing. And the more people use it, the more accurate it will become, particularly if there are corrections and so on fed into it. Now, there are initiatives to move away from the big languages, the ones that Nick had listed. For example, Oxford University Press has launched a project called Oxford Global. Matthias knows about this. So what they're looking at is the kind of second-tier group, developing materials, particularly dictionaries, large dictionaries with oral recordings. And they're working on languages like Zulu and Xhosa in South Africa, Gujarati, Bengali in India, and so on. So Oxford Global has realized Oxford's not doing this for their own health, they're doing it to make money. They have realized that there's actually potential there. I think the future is much closer than Nick seemed to suggest in his answer. You can do pretty good spoken production in languages like Spanish, German, and Chinese, I think. And, you know, within a short period, relatively short period of time, Swahili, Xhosa, Zulu, Gujarati, they will come as well. So, you know, there is a demand, there is a commercial outcome, and I think we'll be moving in that direction. Eventually, I don't know if you know the book which involves the Babel fish, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. they had this idea that you plug the thing in and then you could speak a language and it would automatically come out. Maybe we're not quite at that point, but certainly with smartphones now, the apps and so on that are available, you're getting pretty good spoken interaction coming from them.
This message is for questions for Dr. Austin. Over the years, I've met SOAS students in Bolivia, and for the most part, they've kind of practiced this community engagement, or being respectful of the community. But as you imagine, in many communities, there is a mistrust of researchers or academics who are coming in, and perhaps the communities feel like they're an object of research. So it's great that it's part of the curriculum that you're doing at SOAS. Many times the community see it as a curiosity, as a researcher from outside maybe can read and write the language better than the community, or speak it very well. And so my question is, are there efforts to develop linguists from the community so that they're more than maybe those partners, but they could do the research, but also the community engagement, that they already have the trust of the community? I just wanted to learn about maybe some of the things that you're doing to develop those linguists from the community who have native language.
Hello, is this one working?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so your question is about training for community members in linguistics so that they can do the work themselves, is that right? Okay. In the Sylheti case, we are starting to get younger people who are interested and get engaged, but in this particular case, I don't think that will happen very soon. Linguists are crazy. Linguists are weird people. They're very strange. Being interested in languages and studying and so on is a very odd kind of thing. If you go to the Sylheti community, if they, remember most of them are from working class backgrounds, they're starting to become professional now. In the third generation, we're getting professionals coming out. What they want to study at university is law, accounting, economics, medicine, things that are actually going to make money and that are going to be really valuable and useful for the local community. Linguistics, I think, is a long way down the list of priorities for them, and that's understandable. With the Engaged Project, with the Polish colleagues, there are quite a number of scholars, indigenous scholars, particularly from Mexico, who are involved. So the picture I showed you, Carlos, he's a PhD student from Mexico, and he's writing his PhD at Leiden on his own language, which is called Ayok. We have another scholar called Jenner, who is a postdoctoral researcher, or he has his PhD, and he is a speaker of Yucatec Maya. So there are, for Latin America, there are emerging numbers of people with PhDs. University of Texas at Austin has done a fantastic job with training people from different Central and South American communities. The thing with immigrant groups like the Bangladeshis in London, the top priority for them is training teachers and lawyers and doctors and so on. And I think linguists will eventually, may eventually come, but it's a very strange kind of thing to be doing anyway, even amongst the Catalans or amongst the Spanish or the English speakers.
Ara tenim temps, 5 minuts. Hi ha dues paraules, també dues paraules demanades.
Hi, my question is for Mr. Ostler, and it's about linguistic diversity and history. So are we paying enough attention in our academic research to colonialism in a historic way? So, for example, in the islands of the Caribbean, we have big processes of creolization. Of each island has its own history and had different influences from many European countries. So my question is, what is the role of history in our research, in this multidisciplinary research we are creating now? how do we study colonialism in the linguistic reality of the people of the places we are studying?
This seems to work all right. Well, that question is music to my ears because it's, by and large, how I spend my time is looking at the history of these language communities. That's why I found myself looking to some extent as much at endangering languages as I looked at endangered languages. They have their own dynamics, and by and large, people haven't looked at the dynamics of endangering languages to see what their strengths are. They assume to have great strengths, but I've also shown that they have weaknesses, I think. And one can gather this from looking at the histories of area. I mean, you've talked about the Caribbean, where different islands have different imperial languages which were imposed on them simply because of the almost random effects of the wars between Spain, France, and Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then the economic exploitation of Africans which took place as part of that. Now, you could say that's almost economic history rather than linguistic history, but it has linguistic implications and not very clear generalizable ones. So one can look at it, you can look at this story on the gross global scale, as I've been trying to do, but you can certainly look at it locally and think of the linguistic effects of political and economic changes which came about. In a way, I see that as rather an interesting growth area for linguistics. It might even build a bridge towards the doctors and accountants and lawyers that Peter was just talking about, because we see that this does make a difference in the long term. So what can I say, really, other than say that, yes, I agree with you that historical studies are crucial. And furthermore, and this is something that I just try to get across, I don't know whether it comes across in the rather weak way that I put it across, that the only guide we have to the future really is our past. We are lucky as civilizations go in that we have a lot of historical data to go on, in a way, say that the Romans or the Assyrians and Babylonians did not. So no doubt in all these civilizations there were scholars who were interested in the past and trying to make sense of it. But we are lucky in having a lot of information from historians about the past, and we can also work in terms of archaeology and epigraphy and so on to understand the role of languages in our past. So go to it.
Voldria fer-li una pregunta al senyor Peter Austin. Vostè ha parlat una mica de quins són els diferents aprenentatges que s'estan fent als SOAS per als estudiants que van a fer aquestes investigacions i projectes de revitalització.
Could you please use the translation, Channel 5, English, Channel 5? Channel 5. Channel 5 is English translation.
No t'entenia.
Okay, the question is, what's the role of the study or the creation of a discourse which make legitimate the revitalization processes of languages which are not spoken by many people, and to what extent this discourse may be applied to different contexts?
That's a very good question. There have been lots of arguments put forward for support for languages like Catalan in the past, for example, or Basque and so on. And we can learn from those experiences. We can learn from the discourse, from the discussion, from the methods that were used.
But unfortunately, every language situation is different from every other language situation. So what might work in Spain for Basque doesn't necessarily work for Mijezoque in Mexico. So I think there is a lot we can learn from each other and sharing and explaining to each other, but it also has to be made very much local to the particular context. So what are the local cultural factors? What are the local political issues? What are the personal issues? What are the attitudes of the community? Do they have positive attitudes to their own language or negative attitudes? What are the attitudes of the broader community? So my colleague Julia Salabank at SOAS has been involved in developing methods for sociolinguistic research to uncover issues about attitudes and the ideologies that people have about language. You know, how do they imagine that children learn their languages? Different communities have different views on this. You know, we often think that you have to speak directly to the children and correct them and so on. In many other communities, they don't believe that children actually speak anything until they're 5 or 6 years old. So you don't correct the children, you just speak. So those kind of ideological questions, political issues, beliefs about language, attitudes to language, we need to uncover those, and those are all individual to particular situations. So I think it's very useful and valuable to share experiences and to look at the different rhetorics and the different approaches, but they have to be directed particularly to the particular situations of particular languages and cultures.
We are running out of time. Teòricament hem d'acabar a la 1, que és lunch time. També recordo que at 2 o'clock there is a visit to the Linguae style building for those registered at 2 o'clock, and the next session is at 3:30, again here. I give you an opportunity. Is there still a question here? Someone? The last opportunity in your life? Yes.
Hola, bon dia. Encarni Carrasco, Universitat de Barcelona i Universitat...
Espera, que t'han d'entendre.
No, precisament és per això. Vull fer una intervenció una mica aplicada. Volia demanar... És un comentari, no és una pregunta al senyor Ostler, i li volia demanar en quina llengua li puc parlar que em comprengui. Sí, li puc parlar en català, en castellà, en francès, perquè jo l'anglès el comprenc, però no
Catalan, Spanish, French, because I understand English, but I don't speak English. So I cannot address him directly. No, but this is what I would like to talk about, because we're talking about linguistic diversity and emerging scenarios. Well, I would like to tell him that the concept of lingua franca, well, there's an alternative that people are working on in Europe in different places and universities, which is the concept of intra-understanding, which guarantees that speakers of people who speak different languages can understand each other, and it establishes equitable relationships both between languages and speakers, because there are no domination relationships or asymmetric relationships of competition between people, because each person speaks in the language he or she wants, and that they are in command of. Well, given that I've been working on this for many years, I felt I had the epistemological, academic, and moral obligation to talk about it, and to say that apart from this issue of a lingua franca, there are other alternatives which are quite feasible in countries that speak, or among countries or between countries that speak languages which belong to the same family. It was just a comment. So that's why I was asking what language could I use to make myself understood without needing technology or the translation, because this is how we apply this competence, which is a plurilingual competence, to make ourselves understood, and we have it in ourselves with this capacity of language.
Bueno, yo no sé si es mejor contestarle en
español. I don't know if it would be better to answer in Spanish. I don't understand how
acabar a esta comprensión mutua.
How do you want to bring about this mutual understanding? We need a language. No, that's a plurilingual approach, because we don't submit to using the other party's language or adopting just one language, the lingua franca, but it's just about the fact that each person should speak a language, but they should understand the language of the others. So the method is based on using the links, the closeness of this language. You know.
Claro que vamos a tratar a comunicar con otros idiomas.
Yeah, sure, we'll try to use other languages to communicate, but in my presentation I showed that there are at least 5 different types of bridge between languages which are not easily understood. And that was the purpose of my presentation, but maybe the method that you're suggesting is bilingualism, or a combination of different bilingualisms. But maybe I was wrong, because you don't agree.
Before I give it, there are many different ways of overcoming mutual misunderstanding or incomprehension. I contrasted 5 different ways, of which lingua franca was only one, and it obviously has disadvantages, as you agree. But we need to have some compatibility, other than the ability to smile at each other and to nod our heads, if actual communication is going to take place. So I don't know what you're proposing, other than the 5 different methods that I proposed.
Sorry, I have to interrupt as a moderator, because it's lunch time and there is a visit at 2 o'clock. Thanks a lot for to both. Sorry, I had to interrupt for the lunch time. I enjoy your talk. I couldn't participate as a moderator. It's yours? No. I read your book some years ago, this one, Languages of the World.